Well, I've written that this is just the latest neoconservative debacle of the U.S. neoconservatives. The neoconservatives are the group that took over U.S. foreign policy 30 years ago at the end of the Soviet Union. This neoconservative group said, oh, okay, our rival is gone. We now are the sole superpower. We run the world. We are the hegemon, to use the term that the international relations types use.
Yeah.
Or as the military in the US says, we have full spectrum dominance. Now, the idea was 30 years ago already, we can basically do what we want. And they have tried in Iraq. They have tried in Syria. They have tried in Libya. They have tried in Afghanistan. And what they've tried to do is to say the US runs the show. It fails all the time. When it comes to this war in Ukraine, this has been brewing for 3 decades as well, because the terms of Gorbachev ending the Soviet Warsaw Pact military alliance was that NATO would not take advantage of that, but would also stay where it was. The phrase that was used to Gorbachev was, NATO will not move 1 inch to the east. Of course, as soon as the Soviet Union ended, the United States neocons said, we can do what we want. We don't have to honor any agreement. And they started NATO enlargement. First to Central Europe, probably acceptable and understandable, though a lie. I wouldn't have done it. But to Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, these were countries that had been dominated by the Soviet Union. They're not close to Russia. They weren't any direct threat to Russia to have them as part of NATO. But then, starting in the 2000s with George W. Bush Jr., who really was the neocon administration par excellence, with Cheney as his vice president, the one who made the Iraq War, for example, they enlarged NATO to 7 more countries: Romania, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Now, that's coming pretty close to Russia, and Russia kept saying, don't do this. It's provocative. You told us you never would. You're getting to our borders. You're threatening our security. And then in 2008, George Bush actually did the horror, though privately, of the Europeans, said, we're going to expand NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia. Now, if you look at a map, and I hope your listeners do look at a map, if the NATO alliance expanded to Georgia and Ukraine, the idea was and would be to encircle Russia in the Black Sea, because you'd have NATO in Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia. You'd actually encircle the Russian naval fleet, and as U.S. neocon strategists said, that would end Russia as any kind of even regional power. It couldn't project any kind of power, even naval, in the Eastern Mediterranean. That was the idea. The Russians were beside themselves, and Putin said in the 2008 Bucharest NATO summit to Bush, to his face, if you do this, we will take Crimea, because that is, for us, core security. Americans are incredibly arrogant at this governmental level. They believe they don't have to listen to anybody. But, you know, there was a breathing space in 2010 because a pro-Russian president was elected in Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych.
Yeah.
And he said, we should be neutral. We don't want to be caught in a trap between the United States and Russia. We will be neutral.
Yeah.
But that's not good enough for America. You're either with us or you're against us. So the United States worked pretty hard to overthrow Yanukovych in the so-called Maidan in late 2013 and early 2014.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about what happened in 2014, but I just want to go back to the early 90s, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the promises made to Gorbachev. Namely, if the Warsaw Pact is dissolved, NATO will not move an inch towards the east. That was the promise that was made. A lot of people are disputing that. My question to you is there a paper trail or documentary proof of this agreement, or at least this verbal promise?
It's thoroughly documented. People can go on something called nsarchive.gwu.edu. GWU is George Washington University, and it's the National Security Archive, or nsarchive.gwu.edu. And the title of the folder is NATO Expansion, What Gorbachev Heard. It was a very extensive amount of diplomacy that was used by Hans-Dietrich Genscher, Chancellor Helmut Kohl, James Baker III, the U.S. Secretary of State, to convince Gorbachev to go along with German reunification. It was not casual, it was detailed, it was briefed in detail, it's all documented, it's not an issue. Remember, in statecraft, countries lie. The United States lies for a living. And people could say, yeah, well, what's new? Well, they're lying about this one too. It's convenient to say these promises weren't given, and they say it. And they get away with most things because a powerful government dominates the media. Yeah. But the fact of the matter is, it was explicit. And Gorbachev was very explicit. And that is, yes, we can go forward, but it would not be acceptable for NATO to expand eastward. Yeah. Then Yeltsin picked this up, I know, when he became president. And he said repeatedly to Clinton, don't do this. And then the U.S. government line is, Yeltsin accepted it. What does it mean accepted? What he quote accepted is that Clinton said it's going to happen whether you want it to happen or not. That's what he accepted. He didn't say, oh, that's fine, I understand your point of view. He was given a fait accompli. And then when Putin became president at the end of the 1990s, he specifically, vociferously objected. And in a famous speech that he gave at the Munich Security Conference in 2007, he explained, do not do this. Do not come closer. And in 2008, very interestingly, at the Bucharest summit, European leaders said to me personally how bad an idea this is. But, you know, when you have a dominant power like the United States, these leaders don't speak publicly. They do not talk against the United States. They fear they will get punished one way or another. One European leader said they treat us like children, told me personally. I hear a lot, I see a lot. I know these people personally. I'm just not happy with the U.S. dominating the narrative when it is so dangerous, this misunderstanding.
Professor Sachs, what about the argument that NATO's presence in Eastern Europe ought not to be seen as a threat, as if we in the West gets to decide what might or might not be viewed as a threat by the Russians? NATO is not a threat. NATO is a defense alliance, and countries have the right to decide if they wish to join NATO. So if Ukraine wants to, they have the right to join NATO.
Well, I'd say a couple of things. First, to go back to the Maidan, which is the public square where the protests took place against Yanukovych, I know, by the way, with my own experience, the U.S. was deeply implicated in the overthrow of the pro-Russian president. And in fact, we had politicians like John McCain go and speak to the protesters. And I've tried to say to the Americans, what would it be like if on January 6th, 2021, our insurrection, you had Chinese politicians coming encouraging the protesters to go protest and overthrow the government. But that's exactly what we did. That's all on tape. That's not even disputed. I know that behind the scenes, there were all the machinations because basically the U.S. has an apparatus through the National Endowment of Democracy, through a network of so-called NGOs, and through covert operations of the U.S. to try to twist politics in other countries to U.S. bidding.
Yeah.
Of course, we're horrified if any other country is engaged in ours. But this is normal business for the United States, and it's obnoxious, by the way, because what are U.S. senators speaking to the protesters doing? The moment that Yanukovych was overthrown, then the U.S. recognized the next pro-Western government, and all of the talk of neutrality was thrown aside. Suddenly it was all, we want to be part of NATO. Well, what do you know? And then, as Putin had said, if you go forward this way, I need to take back Crimea because that is absolutely core national security. And he did. Yeah. Then the United States poured in for 7 years heavy NATO weaponry, which is why the Ukrainians are fighting so effectively right now, because the U.S. has been funding and advising and providing intelligence to the Ukrainian military for 7 years. This is a proxy war between the United States and Russia. The Ukrainians are dying, but it's the U.S. weaponry and it's the U.S. intelligence and it's the U.S. operations, it's the U.S. funding that is at the essence of this war. And at the end of 2021, the off-ramp was obvious. The United States just needed to say to Putin's demand not to enlarge, we will not enlarge. Then there would not have been this war. And I called the White House and I said, please negotiate. The White House said, no, this is Ukraine's right. This is ridiculous, by the way, because what we did was trap Ukraine in a devastating proxy war. And it is a bad outcome for Ukraine because Ukraine would have been peaceful and it would have been secure, and it is worse than ever right now. So that's one point. But second point about this right, you know, this is a U.S. military alliance. It is not a defensive alliance. It is a military alliance. It's often offensive. It bombed Belgrade for 41 days in 1999. It overthrew Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. It did the U.S. bidding in Afghanistan from 2005 to 2020. What's defensive about this? It doesn't operate under the UN Charter. It is a U.S. military alliance, which Russia does not want on its 1,000, I think it's 600-kilometer border with Ukraine, and I don't blame them. And I find it absolutely provocative and dangerous that the U.S. has insisted on this. And of course, I say to Americans who don't listen, but anyway, I say to them, suppose that Mexico said, you know, we're a sovereign country. We want to have a military alliance with China because we're not so happy about the way the U.S. proceeds with its war on drugs or anything else, or the refugee problem. So we're going to have a military alliance with China. And you think the United States would say, yeah, that's great. You're a sovereign country. We're so happy for you. Congratulations. The U.S. would invade in a nanosecond. And by the way, when Fidel Castro tried that in 1960, 61, the U.S. invaded. So, and the U.S. announced in 1823 the Monroe Declaration. It said to the Europeans, you keep out of the Americas. It didn't say, these are sovereign countries. They can decide anything they want. It said, point blank, this is our backyard. You keep out of the Americas. Okay, so I'm completely annoyed. And the reason I'm annoyed is that people are dying massively in Ukraine. and we're escalating towards nuclear war, and we're being fed nonsense by the Western media, which basically is regurgitating what the US government is saying.